Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Stillo. I'm a anthropology professor here at Wayne State, and I also wear a lot of other hats. I'll be talking about a few of those in this presentation, including being part of the leadership of multiple NGOs that work on tuberculosis, both globally and in the USA. I've been working on medical anthropology and specifically drug-resistant tuberculosis, especially access issues around drugs and essentially what it takes to make care fit the needs of patients for almost 20 years at this point. Initially, I started working with injection drug users, and in the last 15 years or so, I've been doing mostly tuberculosis work. So I'll be talking about some of that today. In the context of global health and ways of getting the affected community to be part of what we're doing here, trying to make health something that's available for all. Sorry, I'm dealing with some pop-ups here. Okay, I think that's better. And also we'll be talking about the right to health and science. So sort of the umbrella that I'm going to be covering today is global health, ideas about decolonizing and making global health something that is available to everyone, and ways that particularly I have tried to work with the affected community, including TB survivors, to make this a reality. So if you see the title slide here, I would like to start presentations with this. This was the site of my main research site in Romania. This is a mountaintop sanatorium high up on this mountain. There were about 200 people who were living in this very old hospital who had tuberculosis. And this was sort of a rude awakening for me, because it took me a little bit of time to realize as I was living there that virtually everyone that I was interviewing was eventually going on to develop additional drug resistance and dying. So what started out as being a purely academic project, very quickly it became clear that there was also an important aspect to trying to figure out what was going wrong here and how I could help. And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out, well, what do patients actually need? And one of the best ways of doing that, of course, is by asking them. So as a medical anthropologist, I've interviewed hundreds of patients, scores of doctors. In this work, I've also consulted for the World Health Organization in several countries, the European Centers for Disease Control, the Global Fund. And as I said, all of that is really aimed at providing care that is going to enable people to survive what is, at least in theory, a curable disease. But really, like with most conditions, including COVID, who you are and where you live has an awful lot to do with whether you ultimately live or die. Go to the next slide. So the elephant in the room, whenever we're talking about global health, is colonialism and really what international health is based on. And it may seem like this was a very long time ago, but if you're working in countries where that have colonial pasts, that have pasts that are full of racism and outside control, what you find is that the weight of that still weighs very heavily. So these are a couple little snippets that I think show this really well. One of them is this very famous ad from Pear Soap, which discusses the white man's burden. And the other is a news story from quite recently. Actually, the last update on this story was in, I believe, earlier this year, when the woman was found at least to some degree liable, where there are very different standards of who is seen as being appropriate to work in global health and who has something valuable to say. And one of the things that I'll discuss a little bit later is the double standard that we've set, where, for example, a white expert from a northern country can go to a place and within seconds be considered to be someone knowledgeable who has something to say about what's going wrong there. But that doesn't work the other way.
Lose consciousness and have hypotonia. And then if it's an enormous.
Sorry about that. So that doesn't work the other way. So for example, it's quite common for US students to go to another country, and after staying a week or two, they'll write an article about what they experienced and saw, and oftentimes that will get published in a journal. But we rarely see that when it's someone coming from the global South to the global North. You know, there's, for some reason, my expertise as a white man based in the US is internationally relevant and transfers seamlessly. Whereas, for example, colleagues of mine from African countries, I'm thinking of a friend of mine from Rwanda in particular, face barrier after barrier, even though they have great deals of expertise. It's seen as not translating to the global North. So this is something that I want us kind of thinking about as I go through this, and perhaps we can discuss a little bit more at the end. What I'm going to try to do is to get through the actual presentation relatively quickly, because I really would like to have time to discuss some of these things. In many ways, everything that I'm talking about today is, it's an open thing that's up for discussion, and they're really important discussions for us to be having, particularly across disciplines. So I think I would be remiss if I was presenting about global health and we didn't talk about COVID, because COVID is absolutely consuming everyone right now. And I think it's probably the starkest example of the kind of inequity that exists in global health today, both in terms of outcomes, you know, again, who lives and who dies, but particularly in terms of access. In this case, access to life-saving vaccines, and very, very soon in access to life-saving pharmaceuticals, which Pfizer has shown fantastic data on, and one can already see really serious questions about who is going to have access to these treatments. And my somewhat, I guess, depressing prediction is that will probably follow the trend that we see with the vaccines. There's nothing to suggest otherwise. So right now, the most glaring gap is that as of, I believe it was yesterday, only 6% of people on the African continent are fully vaccinated. And that is far, far less than anywhere else. And if you dive down a little bit deeper into those numbers, you have many countries that are even at 1% or below that. There are some countries, particularly in North Africa, that are pulling that average up. But some of the most populous countries, for example, like Uganda, like Kenya, have very, very, very low rates. And you know, it's the same sort of thing that we saw in the US, where folks who didn't necessarily have good access to the vaccines, particularly early on, the discussion was all around vaccine hesitancy. So if we think back to the US early on in when the vaccines became available, there was lots of discussion around vaccine hesitancy among African Americans. And of course, there are a lot of good reasons why African Americans in the US would have some hesitancy, considering the history of racism in medicine and how that still is present today in terms of health outcomes for African Americans in this country, in terms of patterns of prescribing pain medicine, in terms of maternal mortality and things like that. And we see the same sort of thing in Africa, but it's a little bit absurd, because in countries where there's absolutely not even anywhere near enough supply to cover the population, there are discussions and webinars around reducing hesitancy, when really, I think, quite the obvious problem is supply. And this is something that only in the last, I would say, couple of weeks has there been real movement on. There's finally been a push from the World Health Organization. There have finally been more donations that are starting to increase supply, but still the supply that's needed is far less than what's available. So this brings up all kinds of questions about, well, in the face of a global pandemic, when we had imagined initially that the world would come together and make sure that the fruits of science are available to all. And some of us, including me, were optimistic. We see the same patterns being repeated. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the human rights framework that sort of overarches all of this, and how this both provides a lens that we can view what's happening, as well as mechanisms that we can use in order to try to improve access and ultimately improve people's health. So the covenant that I'll be talking about today is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this was ratified in, I believe it's up to 166 countries now, which means it's legally binding. It's legally binding actually in the vast majority of countries in the world, the United States being a disappointing exception. We do not acknowledge international human rights law. However, as I said previously, even if the human rights law is not the law of the land here, it is a mechanism that we can use in order to assess and also guide what we should be doing through mechanisms like foreign aid. So there are two aspects of this covenant that I'm going to discuss. One of them is the right to health, and the other, very importantly, is the right to science. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way these are connected. So first, human rights are intimately connected together. So we can talk about discrete human rights, within the covenant, they're numbered and they exist separately. But really, when we're talking about them and when we're working with them in real life, what we find is that all of these rights are enmeshed together in ways that make it really difficult to pull them apart. And one of the strongest points that I want to make today, and it's one that I think as one looks at these issues becomes quite obvious, is that you absolutely cannot achieve the right to health unless you achieve the right to science. This is absolutely crucial because ultimately science is what's driving our progress in health forward. Science is what's providing the vaccines and the life-saving pharmaceuticals. So without these tools, we can't make the right to health work. So there are two important parts to the right to science, and we'll talk a little bit about both of these today. One of them is this right to participate in the scientific progress, in the process. So this can mean a range of things, such as participating in research, actually being in clinical trials. It can also be, ideally, in terms of participating in developing research questions. So the way that I would argue things should work is that people who are affected by diseases, the general community, the affected community, should have a role in deciding, well, what is the direction that research should go? What are the qualities and traits that are useful for diagnostics and pharmaceuticals and things like this? So that way, ultimately, what is produced are things that will be appropriate and acceptable for those people who end up needing them. And we've seen some quite bad examples when this doesn't work. For example, diagnostic technologies, which work fantastically in labs in California, but then when you bring them to the developing world where temperatures are high, where there's lots of dust in the air, they fail. And lots of money gets wasted because these products work fantastic in a laboratory clean room, but they don't work out there in the real world. So getting out in front of issues like that is really important. The other issue that is specified in the right to health, and this is an important one, is that what this actually means is that people should benefit from tangible things. So it doesn't mean that the right to science will just in some unclear way improve everyone's lives. That's not what the UN interpretation is at all. What they're talking about is access to real concrete things like vaccines, like diagnostic technologies, and like medicines. Now, one aspect of the Human Rights Covenant here is the idea of progressive realization. And when I was first learning about this, I was a little bit confused and disappointed, because by my initial reading, what this sounded like was that things can just go on forever. And as long as there are baby steps being made, things are okay. That's not at all what the intent is here. And actually it's specified that what is required is action in a reasonably short period of time. So what there should be are deliberate, concrete targets, steps in order to realize the right to health, the right to science. So the idea is that there needs to be a plan. And one of the most important reasons why there has to be a plan is because of this next part, which is what they call the duty of states in a position to assist. So under this mechanism, the wealthier states have an obligation to provide both economic and technological assistance to help developing countries realize these rights. Now, the only way that can really effectively happen, though, is if there is a plan. What is it that the country needs in order to reach these steps? And I've been part of some conversations around this that, I'll be honest, are a little absurd. Where, for example, where I was working in Romania, the head of the National Tuberculosis Program was arguing with someone from the Global Fund, and basically the conversation was like this. The national TB head said, first you give us the money, and then we'll give you the plan. And the Global Fund said, no, first you have to give us the plan, and then we'll give you the money. And it went sort of back and forth. The plans are absolutely crucial. And this is something that I think this is a good area where there can be really fruitful collaboration between academics, between folks based at universities. I've been involved in some of this work in terms of figuring out what should these plans look like? What are steps that are achievable that will ultimately bring you to a point where additional funds can solve these problems? Because ultimately what you end up with sometimes is a situation where you just, local folks on the ground are doing the best they can, but they just don't have the capacity. So by showing exactly where things go off the rails, so to speak, we can, and where money would be, very useful and strategically used, we can kind of help accelerate things forward. So really the important concept here is enabling. This is what this idea is all about. Actually enabling states to provide the best possible healthcare for their citizens. And this is where the international community, this is where donor funding comes in. Now, sometimes one of the things that comes up, one of the criticisms of these discussions, of these ideas, when we start talking about making vaccines and pharmaceuticals more available and accessible, are questions of, well, someone has to make money on this. These are private companies and things like that. And I think it's really important to know that much of the so-called privately developed science, privately developed medicines and diagnostics and things like that are actually publicly supported. And oftentimes they're publicly supported in ways that aren't necessarily obvious. Once it's a drug that's patented, that's on the market, because a lot of this support happens long before it has a fancy name and a registration. It's happening in terms of basic science research at public universities. It's happening in terms of US government-sponsored clinical trials. It's happening in terms of private donor-funded research, for example, like the Gates Foundation, like the Wellcome Trust, as well as mechanisms like tax incentives, FDA priority review vouchers, which can be valued up to several $100 million. And these are awarded generally when a pharmaceutical company develops a treatment for a neglected or disease which is considered to be a public health priority. So for example, there was one awarded for developing a new tuberculosis drug to a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson several years ago. And there are other mechanisms like this, both within the United States as well as in the European Union, that are aimed at encouraging research and supporting even private pharmaceutical companies. So there is a lot of this kind of support. Now, in order to make things, medicines, diagnostics, and things like that accessible, there are some mechanisms available, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about these at the end of the presentation and the discussion. So for example, things like intellectual property waivers, where a pharmaceutical company might say, we're not going to enforce the patent rights on this. Things like technology transfers, where a developer will say, and we're starting to see some of this finally in relation to vaccines and producing them in Africa for COVID, where a developer will give the technology that's needed to make something to another country so that they can produce it locally to increase supply. So we've seen that in South Africa, where they're now producing vaccines of their own. And potentially, I believe in Senegal, there's a project that is getting started as well around that. Another mechanism is the idea of compulsory licenses, which is part of the TRIPS agreement as part of the World Trade Organization. And the way that these work, and they're very, very seldom used, is that a country can say there is a public health emergency. And what they can do is they can issue a license to produce something. Oftentimes, initially, a lot of these were around HIV drugs. I know Thailand and Zimbabwe issued these in the 1990s. And the idea is that a country determines what is a local emergency, so they can determine the duration of time. They can even determine the amount that they're able to pay for access to that technology, and then they're able to produce that product. And there have been a lot of discussions around possibly using this related to COVID. One of the downsides, and oftentimes this comes with incredible pressure from the United States not to do this, is that some folks see this as potentially disrupting, in the international pharmaceutical industry. But the idea is that this is a mechanism that's available, in case of emergency. Other mechanisms would include making technology and freeing up intellectual property for making generic production and speeding that up so one doesn't have to wait for the patents to expire to do that. And there's some discussion now as to whether Pfizer is going to do that with the new COVID pill that they have developed, and I hope that will greatly increase its availability and might solve some of the problems that we've seen related to the vaccine access. And then finally, ideas like pooled procurement and distribution. So something like the WHO Global Drug Facility, COVAX, the Global Vaccine Alliance. These are our organizations, our mechanisms which allow for things to be procured in large amounts and then distributed to places that need it most at reduced or at free prices. And oftentimes, instead of seeing these mechanisms, what we see, what's much more common, are donations from the manufacturers and bilateral donations. So for example, the US government will pay a pharmaceutical company for a drug or for a vaccine, and then it will donate that drug to a country in need. But the problem with that is these don't do anything. Just providing these donations does not do anything in terms of increasing local capacity to produce it on their own, to provide it to the people. So it does work, but it's more of a Band-Aid than actually providing a sustainable solution. Now, some examples from the tuberculosis world. I'll switch gears a little bit here. And tuberculosis is, up until COVID, was the infectious disease that killed most people globally. And everyone is certain that as soon as we finally get COVID under control, that will be the condition once again, where about 1.6 million people will die every year from tuberculosis. And it's an area where the tools are very much inadequate. There is not an effective vaccination for tuberculosis, even though it's one of the oldest diseases that affects humanity. We have very poor diagnostic technologies. It's made the folks in the TB world a little jealous, seeing how quickly the COVID testing has ramped up, whereas we still don't have point of care tests that are rapid and affordable. We don't have reliable ways to diagnose children. We don't have reliable ways to diagnose TB that is outside of the lungs. It can occur anywhere in your body. And we also don't have effective, safe, and short regimens. Treatment is still at least 6 months, and the drugs can have quite severe side effects, including hearing loss, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit. But even if technology and the magic of medical science provided all of these things that I just said we're missing today, we would not be able to get them to the people that need it most. So there's both the problem of the science is not there and the science is not being adequately supported, but also there's the problem of ensuring access, which is something that we really fail at. We fail at in the world of global health for a lot of reasons. One of them, in my opinion, is a lack of ambition. I think in tuberculosis, it's a little bit frustrating because while we do lack the magic bullets that we hope we can find to really beat this disease, we also see in the wealthiest countries very, very low rates of the disease and people rarely dying from it. So what you see is a different set of standards for the wealthy countries versus those that are developing, where people who get this disease have access to the best treatment that's available, which is not ideal, but still works. But then in other places, for example, like where I was working in Romania, you would have people dying of this very, very curable disease because they didn't have access to the tools that we do. Now, one of the most important elements in terms of planning policy, in terms of providing the best possible care, is consulting with people who are affected by the diseases. This is, as I had mentioned previously, part of the right to science. And it's something that I've spent a lot of time working on in the last 10 years. Actually trying to involve people who are tuberculosis survivors who know more than I do about what it's like to be treated for that disease because they've actually gone through it. Whereas it doesn't matter if I interview 100 people or 1,000 people, I'm never really going to understand how those drugs make you feel, what it does to your family when you're not able to work for 6 months and you're taking drugs which are making you feel worse than the disease itself does. So it's important to involve people who have this experience in um, our approach to beating the disease. So this includes involving them in research. This includes involving them in policy in terms of designing, well, what should diagnostic algorithms look like? What makes the most sense for patients? What types of drugs are the most desirable? What methods of providing follow-up care are the least disruptive to patients? So this is actually a slide that I had used in a training I gave in Ukraine a bit before the pandemic. And I included this very large yes, because I was actually getting pushback from not only doctors, but also some patients in the room questioning whether this was an appropriate thing for them to be doing. And in my opinion, it absolutely is. This is about making sure that the medical system is really serving the needs of the people who ultimately it is designed to serve. So some of the work that we do is around taking people who have been affected by tuberculosis, including TB survivors, like several of the people in this picture. This is us at a conference several years ago. And having them be part of clinical trial design, assessing research, communicating research results to the community. So these are community advisory boards. And in this picture, you have people representing community advisory boards from Mongolia, Republic of Moldova, Georgia, Brazil, and India. And this is a relatively new movement within the tuberculosis world. It's something that has been more common in the HIV world, but it's starting to form a critical mass where there are now a lot of people who have survived TB, who are now taking part in TB research, working with drug developers and things like that to help develop products that are going to really serve people. And also part of this is about keeping developers honest and making sure that people who really need access to the drugs get these drugs through mechanisms, for example, like pre-approval access programs. So how can people who desperately need a drug get access to it before it receives FDA or European Medicines Agency approval? There are mechanisms for that. So this has been a lot of the other work that we've been involved in to make sure that, okay, this drug has gone through all of these trials, has not yet received full approval, but there are people who might die because they can't get access to it. So this is another part of that work, really making sure that people have access to life-saving care. Now, finally, I had mentioned earlier this issue of the adverse reactions to TB drugs, and in particular, one of them being hearing loss. And this is probably the most important news that's happened in the tuberculosis space in the time that I've worked in it, most certainly. One of the things I realized as I was interviewing patients is that many of them couldn't hear me well. And that was tough. I was talking through an N95 through a lot of the time, and it was a challenge that some folks couldn't hear clearly, or in some cases couldn't hear at all. And what I found was a lot of people were going deaf, and that was sort of taken as being just something we're stuck with. Doctors, in fact, would say, would you rather be deaf or dead, when a patient complained about hearing loss? But what I found through qualitative research is that the hearing loss was actually doing a great deal of damage, doing damage to people's family lives, destroying people's ability to work. So even though they were living, ultimately when they were quote unquote cured, they were not re-entering society in a way that really enabled them to be the person that they were before. And this really came to a head in 2016 when some of us, it was a random email that I received along with a few people from WHO, some people from Partners in Health and MSF, and it was from a social worker in Romania. And the social worker said, I have a woman here who suddenly lost her hearing. Her husband has left her and he took the children, and we don't know what to do. And so one of the things that we decided to do was that we would work together as a group and initially try to write articles, try to do something to make sure that more people knew what was going on and ultimately try to change practice. So this article, The Devil We Know, is one of the products that came out of that work. It's a collaboration between people from Partners in Health, people from MSF, as well as several TB survivors who had lost their hearing. And that made a big splash in the TB world. And, really in it, we were asking, should we be using these drugs that we don't have a great evidence base for saying that they work very well, but we do know that they're causing a great deal of harm? And we were asking that at a time when there were 2 new tuberculosis drugs on the market that the vast majority of the world did not have access to, but that did not have these side effects. So ultimately, what was happening is people in wealthier countries were able to access treatment that would not make them deaf, but people in the developing world didn't have access to those new pharmaceuticals, so they continued to have hearing loss. So then things started to move pretty quickly, because apparently we weren't the only ones who thought this was a problem. So USAID called together a meeting. I think this was maybe in the summer of 2017. And then one of the most important things that happened is South Africa decided unilaterally that the World Health Organization recommendations were not good enough for them. So South Africa said, we think these drugs are doing more harm than good. We're not going to use them. We're going to use the new pharmaceuticals instead. And that sort of forced the rest of the world to reckon with this, because now you had a developing country saying that the standard of care that is available to the rest of the world is not good enough for us. Now, in the midst of all this, I had been working on a project with some TB survivors, 14 of them from 12 different countries. That's the next slide, yeah. And we have been working on this since the very beginning, but it turned out to be a lot harder than any of us expected. I was a bit naive going into this, and I thought we would be able to get this published shortly after we published the scientific article. And for a lot of reasons, that didn't happen. So what we did was we sought out TB survivors who had hearing loss, and ultimately 14 people from 12 different countries agreed. And many of them agreed not to be anonymous, but rather to be co-authors. And they told their stories, and together we all developed a set of recommendations for what we thought would be better care. They, looking at their experiences, gave recommendations, and I was really excited to get this published, and it got rejected after rejection. And I think part of the problem goes back to the question that I raised in the beginning about colonialism and who has a right to speak about global health. Who gets to be part of these conversations in medical journals. And in the peer reviews that we got, in fact, one of them explicitly said that I should be telling the story of maybe 2 of these people. And it wasn't necessary to hear from all of them, and it wasn't necessary to have them as co-authors. And I responded that I respectfully disagreed, that the entire point, it's in the title of the article, is to make survivors' voices heard, to really hear from them what their experiences were, and what they recommend as people who have been cured of TB, who now deal with the, the everyday reality of not being able to hear. So ultimately, we succeeded in getting it published. It's something I'm really proud of. And I think, for me, this was my attempt at, putting my money where my mouth is. We talk a lot about decolonizing global health and giving voice to people outside of the global north and, respecting affected communities. And I wanted to see if we could do this, if we could really incorporate these folks into the research process, make them co-authors, and I'm really glad we were able to do that. There were even questions as far as whether it was ethical to include TB survivors as authors, as if they would not have the objectivity to be able to write a scientific article. So we have a lot of work to do in this area, I think, in terms of making global health research, global health publishing, something that everybody can take part in, particularly people who are most affected by it. And one of the things that I'm proudest of is the woman who we received that email about so many years ago is actually one of the authors of this article. So everything kind of went full circle, and she finally got to tell her story. And this is a quote from her from the article. And she said, she was describing, the absolutely unimaginable disruption that this did to her life. She said, this disease leads to a loss of hearing, family breakdown, loss of friends, loss of work. In my job, communication is very important. I wonder how I will raise my children if I can no longer work. How can I take them to the sea? I can barely go shopping or to the park. At this moment, my husband and I do not know each other. We're like two strangers. I'm not able to take any of the new or repurposed drugs here in Romania. They weren't available. My wish is that no one else has to face the challenges that have begotten me. I wish I had access to treatment that could have prevented my hearing loss. So this is exactly what I think is important to hear is, the real harm that it causes when there are different standards for different kinds of people and the harm that can be caused when that standard, for example, what was available in Romania, which is a European Union country, can cause so much harm. So I'll leave it at that. So we have some time for comments. I would love it to hear questions about any of the things that we talked about today: access to pharmaceuticals, decolonizing global health, the work I've done with TB. So please, the floor is open. Thank you very much. Maybe we can put questions into the chat. That might be the easiest way to handle that. Or if folks want to unmute themselves, I think that is possible as well. We'll be able to hear in the presentation room.
Hi, Dr. Stillo. This is Carol Baldwin. I work in international programs, and I wondered how you got a journal editor to agree with you that personal accounts were valuable and added to your piece rather than detracted from it.
That took a little bit of work.
Mm-hmm.
And actually we had done some of the work up front to make this happen. We had reached out to the editor of the International Journal of Tuberculosis and Lung Disease, and they had agreed that it would be valuable to hear from the patients. But the problem we ran into was that the editors changed over the long course of time that it took to put this article together, which included translating from lots of different languages, which included lots of translating, lots of communicating back and forth, as well as constantly having to update the piece because the World Health Organization treatment guidelines were changing as we were writing, which was a really great problem to have. But yeah, those discussions were challenging. And finally, we found Public Health Action, which saw the value of the piece and recognized our desire to get it out there. But yeah, I think this is a challenge. And I think it speaks to this issue of whether as a global health community or as a global scientific community, we're really serious about making different kinds of voices heard than the typical ones that you hear from universities in the global north. This was, as I said, I was a little naive going into this project, and it was harder than we thought it would be, but ultimately they did.
You wouldn't think a first person account would not be considered valuable. Did you pitch this at all to audiology journals to perhaps look at this situation from a different perspective?
That's a great question. And actually this work kind of straddled, I forget when it was, but there was a global declaration about hearing loss. So it was actually a major, from the World Health Assembly, a major concern. But in the end, we decided that that would be a little bit of preaching to the choir. We were really dead set to get this in front of people in the tuberculosis and global health world. So the journal that we ended up publishing it in is a sister journal to the major tuberculosis journal. So that way it would be open access and still in that orbit of folks who work in TB. So that was the thinking there, because so often I think, and we had other plans as well if that failed, but really it was important to us that the people who needed the convincing were TB doctors and folks that work in that area. So we really wanted to get it out to them. We could have published it in other locations much more easily, but I think it might not reach the audience that we were hoping for.
Great, thank you for that information. It would have been soul crushing, I think, to put in all that work and then have it relatively dismissed, but good for you for pushing on.
Thank you.
What is the mechanism by which the drug treatment induces deafness, and is it a consequence of a prolonged treatment, or does it occur with any treatment with that drug?
So it's this class of drug does damage to the small hairs in the ear that enable us to hear, and some of the challenges with that is there's and actually I should give credit to Michael Drasher, who's also one of the authors of the article, who's in the room here, who's my MD PhD student, who helped us on some of this. One of the challenges with this is we don't really understand the mechanism. So these drugs accumulate in the fluid in the ear, and some people experience, and this is one I think one of the most important messages of our article, is that different people experience hearing loss in very different ways. So it can happen over time, and I think this is the more common way that it happens, where initially you lose the high frequencies, so you don't even know that you're losing your hearing. And as the hearing loss becomes more progressive, it starts to affect the frequencies, of human speech. But by the time that has happened, you already have significant hearing loss, and that can happen over the course of weeks, months. Also, because the substances accumulate in the ear, they will continue doing damage even after treatment is stopped. So the right way to handle using these drugs is you do baseline audiometry, and periodically you check, people's hearing. And the minute you detect anything, you discontinue use if you have to use these drugs at all, because as I said, there are more effective, more tolerable options available. And now, in fact, globally, there are still a lot of stragglers, but the WHO has removed these drugs from what one would receive normally with TB treatment, unless there was a very compelling reason to use these drugs. People shouldn't be getting them. But what we're finding is they still are in a lot of parts of the world over concerns of costs and access. So, but for other people, they'll lose their hearing quite suddenly. So there's a journalist who was one of our co-authors, and she said she took a nap, and when she woke up, her hearing was completely gone. You know, she could hear, but in that very short period of time, something happened and she lost it. And we don't really understand, you know, why is it that some people have an experience like that versus why is it that some people are having, you know, these much more prolonged losses. And thankfully, you know, as the guidelines have changed, hopefully we don't have to see much more of that. But yeah, that the actual pharmacokinetics of this are challenging.
Are there any other side effects that are as demonstrable as a hearing loss?
Yeah, these are not great drugs. There's kidney damage is another one that's quite common with using these drugs. Anemia, off the top of my head, I think there are some more rare cardiac complications. It's a class of drugs where, and this is why I think we got so much attention with the initial scientific article, because basically what we did was we took here's the evidence that we have that these drugs work against TB. And that was quite weak and quite old. And then here's the evidence that we have over, you know, tens of thousands of cases. You know, we did a meta-analysis of it, of all of the side effects, including the hearing loss. And what we found was that the hearing loss, depending upon how they were measuring it, which is really important. In some cases, it was just whether, you know, someone could hear a voice, not, you know, professional audiometry. In some cases, the rates of hearing loss were very, very, very low. And then in other studies, they were as high as 61%. And things that contribute to that much higher rate of hearing loss are HIV status, low body mass index, and some other comorbidities. So there were certain populations, as well as some genetic aspects that I don't fully understand, that predispose people to this kind of damage. So there were certain populations that were very, very much at higher risk of the hearing loss, and they tended to be populations that were more vulnerable. So this was another reason why, you know, we really needed to find a solution for this.
Does anybody recover naturally from TB without treatment?
Yeah, up to 20% of people historically. And this was one of the crazy things about my research site. At my research site, the rate of recovery was lower than the historical, what they call spontaneous cure. So if you go way back in time to when we didn't have antibiotics to treat tuberculosis, up to 20% of people would be cured, you know, because your immune system would be able to fight off the bug. And what we had to offer was basically rest and good food. So to have Romania having a cure rate of 16%, it really boggled the mind. One of the older doctors was the first person who clued me into this, you know, historical data, and he said, you know, we are really doing something bad here, that, you know, we're not achieving that. And a lot of it had to do with access to medicines. At the sites that I was mainly based in, they didn't have access to the medicines that they needed, you know, because of supply chain disruptions, because of an inability to pay for them, as well as some issues like drugs not being available in that country because of intellectual property issues and things like that. So ultimately what was happening was folks who were getting treated in the state hospitals, not the two that were funded by the Global Fund, had cure rates that were just about as bad as you can imagine. In fact, everyone who I worked with at those sites eventually died, every single one of them.
So in some ways, it sounds like the attempt to cure it may actually interfere with your natural immunity, unless you have that comorbidity factor.
Well, at best, you're going to have a 1 in 5 shot, on your own. If you looking at the historical data, which is not good. These are, if any of these people had been in the US or Western Europe, they would have had cure rates upwards of 85% or more. It's quite rare to lose people to TB if it's properly diagnosed and properly treated. It's not to say that we don't lose people to TB. There were just 2 pediatric TB deaths in Texas earlier this year, and that was completely due to the COVID has basically taken everyone who works on TB and forced them to work on COVID. And what happened was these children were not diagnosed in time and ended up dying. There'll be some of us at Stop TB USA are working on an op-ed about this, but basically that, this is what happens when you take your eyes off, this disease. So, as I said in the beginning, it all depends on who you are and where you are. Whether, a curable infectious disease will kill you, or, you'll go on to live a long, healthy life. Any other questions from the audience here or on Zoom? Please go ahead and unmute yourselves. We have a few minutes still. Sure, go ahead.
So you talk a lot about the value of hearing from survivors, and it's a growing trend similar to community health worker models, empowering the agency of survivors. With the Ebola outbreak and response, there was a lot of struggle to be able to fund survivors and social mobilizations who could share their stories, to adopt behavior change to contain the outbreak. And a lot of that was because of limitations of funding. And you had a really good point about how donor funding should be enabling, where erroneous limitations such as you can't employ someone who's not literate in English, even though they're working in a tribal language zone, doesn't necessarily translate. What are some other ways that we can advocate for donor funding to be more enabling?
That's a really good question. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of some of the barriers that our own policies have made to make that more difficult. And it's something actually that we're struggling with. We're thinking through in the NGOs that I work with, for example. It's one thing for me, I donate a ton of my time. This is not, one does not get rich doing this kind of work. In fact, one doesn't get paid to do this kind of work. And that's fine that I donate a large chunk of my time to community involvement and training communities. But the survivors that we work with come from, developing countries. They're not independently wealthy, and that can be quite a burden on them. So some of the things that we're thinking of is, for example, the Global Community Advisory Board that I work with. We're trying to think of ways that we can do better than just making participation cost neutral. So for example, right now, through Treatment Action Group is the convening organization, and they have funding through the Gates Foundation. And they use that to enable survivors and activists from all over the world to do some of this kind of work. And they make it cost neutral. So if I go to do a training in Ukraine or Thailand, they'll pay for my hotel and my flight, and but not my time. And that's fine for me. But for someone who is in a developing country, who has a family to support and has to take time off from work, they're still making a big sacrifice. So there are some discussions now as far as how can we make it so that way community participation is actually feasible for a larger swath of people, not just those who who have the money and the time to be able to do it. That that requires donors being willing to fund things like that. Yeah, and this is one of the discussions we always have in my global health classes. We think about what are the things that we need, in order to make real transformation in global health. And oftentimes they're the sorts of things that are not funded. We don't necessarily need more buildings and projects with very discrete deliverables. What we need are things that are going to broadly build capacity, that are going to train people, train a new generation of health workers, community health workers. We need to increase that local capacity. And currently, we really don't have funders that do that work. The Global Fund does not do very much of it. It's much more disease specific, even though they do offer what they call health system strengthening grants. Those grants only make up a tiny sliver of what the overall funding is. Same manner, USAID doesn't really do that work. Gates is much more focused on technological solutions like vaccines and pharmaceuticals. So ultimately, we don't really have a funder for that. There are small groups that are kind of doing it piecemeal. There's little bits here and there, but no, it's one of the major stumbling blocks is that for folks to do this kind of work, they are making a sacrifice, and many are willing to, because they realize they were lucky enough to survive TB. So they, for example, like a few of the people in the picture I showed earlier, are TB survivors who, want to make a difference. But no, there's not a clear, easy way of kind of funding this, at least with the current funding mechanisms we have. Any other questions, comments? If not, we can end things. I don't think we're getting anything from Zoom. So thank you everybody so much for coming. I hope this was really interesting for you. This was absolutely my pleasure to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which countries have you been to in this quest?
So most of the research I do is in Romania. I've been working on TB there since about 2006. I've also done a lot of work in Republic of Moldova. I've been to Russia. I've been to South Africa, Thailand. But mainly the work that I do is in the European region. That's the area where I really know the health systems and I know the problems. So I try to kind of focus my work there, as the place that I can make the most impact.
What are the rates in the US compared to other developing nations?
So the United States actually has one of the lowest rates of TB in the world. We have a rate of about 2 point something per 100,000 people. So that's one of the very, very lowest that you find. We put a lot of effort into fighting TB because it used to be a major US health problem. Up until about the mid 1960s, it was absolutely normal that people would be dying of TB. So we used, and I think it's a great example, as we talked about, some solutions we see as being appropriate for the developed world, but not for the developing world. And the tools that we use to get to this very low rate of TB in the United States are tools that have been available since the 1960s. The same pharmaceuticals that we're using to treat TB right now are the same ones we were using in 1965. It takes 6 months. The treatment success is well over 85%. It's quite good. We do active case finding. We treat preventatively. So, we've managed to get it to the point where the vast majority of our cases in the US are either people who are foreign born who might have what they call latent TB infection, where they have been exposed to TB and it's in their body, but they're not contagious. They don't have active disease. But 10% of people with TB infection, which is a quarter of the world has it, will ultimately go on to develop active TB, and then they would be contagious. This is why we preventatively treat everyone in the US. We're finally getting to a point in the global space where experts are starting to accept that we should be doing that globally. So as I said, the tools that we used to get to this point have been available, but there has been real resistance on the part of some of the international funders, especially, to really do that kind of like heavy duty public health kind of work. But it works, and we've demonstrated that. I think the desire is more for a quick fix, a highly effective vaccine, a much shorter treatment. But we've been waiting a long time, and TB is a tricky bacteria, and vaccination efforts have not. All the promising candidates in the past decade or so have ultimately failed. So I'm hoping that with all of the enthusiasm coming off the development of these COVID vaccines, and they are now looking at mRNA-based vaccines for TB, that maybe that will yield something. But ultimately, I think the problem has been we've been doing like good basic public health, good basic medicine in the wealthier countries. And in the meantime, the developing world is told to wait for, the magic bullet vaccine, or, we haven't really rolled out the preventative treatment, the active case finding, and all of that stuff that I think could have helped stem this problem.
You mentioned, sorry, not from a medical background, but you mentioned that antibiotics have been used to start treatment.
Yeah, TB is a bacteria. So antibiotics are there. All these drugs are antibiotics.
So my question is about the concern of antibiotic resistance. Is that
It's a massive concern. Actually, it's one of the main focuses of my work. So most of the people that I work with have drug-resistant TB.
Wasn't most of the drug-resistant TB developed as a consequence of treatment here in this country, or is it something that developed everywhere?
It's developed everywhere, and in fact, drug resistance is just a natural part of the way bacteria work. So if you read the like early historical 1950s accounts of people being treated with some of the initial pharmaceuticals that were available, they were documenting drug resistance immediately back then. Some people were not responding to isoniazid, which was one of the first drugs that they were using, and it was because they were resistant. Because the bacteria are multiplying, they're not necessarily multiplying or mutating. They're not necessarily mutating to beat a particular drug. They're just wildly mutating. And some of those mutations will yield drug resistance. So one of the things I tell my students is, right now, there's tuberculosis out there in the world that is resistant to the next drug that we have not yet invented yet. And that's just, the way that it works. Now, if you are incorrectly treating TB, so the reason we use a regimen, a combination of drugs, is to stop the risk of developing additional resistance. And in fact, at the Romanian hospitals that I was working at, because they were providing what they had in stock. And that might have been 2 of the 4 or 5 drugs that were necessary. So not only were they not curing people, but they were actually increasing antibiotic resistance in those people as they went through the long journey of eventually dying. But TB takes a long time to kill you. So yeah, this is one of the major issues. So you have both, the wild resistance that's happening, and then you have resistance that is developed because of improper treatment. And rarely, and this is an area where we often blame the patient, but more often than not, and this is one of the important findings of my work, is it's not the patient's fault. It's not, they're not under control of the things that are ultimately yielding the drug resistance. Like in the case of the Romanians, they weren't receiving the drugs that they were prescribed. And the doctors knew that it was bad, but ultimately it was a problem that went way, above what they were, had control of. So all they could do was document in their daily treatment sheets, this drug was missing, and these two were here. And I use that data ultimately, to make an argument for, why things were so bad there.
Is reinfection common after cure?
It can be, yeah. Particularly if you're in a community, TB is airborne like COVID. So if you're in a community where there's a fair amount of it, you can easily get reinfected. In fact, one of the things that happens that's quite dangerous, we found this in Republic of Moldova when we were there working with WHO, is that people were going into the hospital with drug susceptible TB. So your basic garden variety TB, which we would treat with the same 4 drugs we use here in the US and cure you in 6 months. And because they were insisting on hospitalizing those people, they were being exposed to very drug-resistant TB and were getting what you call a super infection. So not only did they have the strain of regular drug-susceptible TB, but they also had drug-resistant TB. So what happens, and this was happening in Romania too, at our sanatorium for sure. So what happens is you treat the people for drug-susceptible TB, you cure that TB, but those drugs are not going to cure the bugs that are resistant, which they picked up in the hospital. So then that is going to multiply. And, and this is why being in a TB hospital that doesn't have good infection control measures, that's not testing people, that's not isolating people and figuring out what their drug resistance is before they put them in a room with other people, or before they let them eat in the community dining room or community bathrooms or whatever, is really dangerous.
So there is a diagnostic method for determining whether or not a strain is drug resistant.
Yes.
In the lab.
And depending upon where you are, that information can either be available to you in a couple hours, or in Romania, when I was working there, that would only be known after several months. Because what they were doing is they were growing the cultures on solid media, and it can take up to 2 months to grow that culture. And then you have to try to grow that culture in the presence of the various antibiotics. This is the way they did it in the 1950s, and this is the way that I learned how to do it when I was working in this laboratory in Romania, using the same kinds of techniques. So in that instance, you wouldn't know. But at that same time, the technology was available. It's actually, in fact, I have a little, I didn't use this slide. This little, oops, probably lost it. It's a cartridge-based technology that they use it to test for COVID. They use it to test for MRSA and other kinds of infections. It's called Gene Expert. And you take a sputum sample, you put this thing in the machine, and you can get results within a couple hours. And you would know whether the person has tuberculosis and whether it's resistant to the one most powerful drug that we have. And if it's resistant to that drug, then you treat it as if it's drug-resistant TB. Efforts to make this available everywhere have been really challenging. even with US financial support to get the cost of those cartridges down, the US government and Gates Foundation, I think, what was it, paid Cepheid $11 million to bring the cost of those individual cartridges down to $10 to make it affordable in the developing world. However, what I found when I was consulting for Global Fund, this is right before the pandemic, I want to say in late October, is that they cost $100 in Romania. And a friend of mine who works in Mexico in the TB program said the same thing. Their local distributor charges $100 per test. So that cost is simply not feasible in the developing world. So even though the machine will be in the laboratory, once the number of cartridges that have been donated by whatever funder disappear, the hospital can't afford to buy any more. And that's what we found in Romania. We asked them how many tests they were doing per year. I kind of knew this was going to be a problem, so we poked a little to find out. And we said, okay, well, how many tests have you done like year to date? And they showed us, and there was basically like a drop off where they had been doing lots and lots and lots of this tests, as people were coming into the hospital to know, should this person be isolated? Are they putting other patients potentially in danger? And then they just simply stopped doing it. And they went back to using microscopy and growing cultures. And we said, well, what's going on here? You stopped using the Gene Expert machine in this month. And they said, well, it's $100 per test. So our hospital basically won't allow us to use this unless someone comes in at death's door. So they were only doing very, very, very few, which is not at all what the aim is. So we absolutely have the tools we need to know, whether somebody has drug susceptible or drug resistant TB. But up until very recently in the developing world, the protocol has been, and this is how it was in Romania when I worked there, you treat the person for drug susceptible TB. And if you think maybe they have drug resistant TB, you order the test, which can take months. Now, in that period of time, someone is being treated every day with antibiotics. They're not getting better. They're away from their family, hospitalized. And then finally, 2 months later, and I'm thinking specifically of a young man that went through this. His dad had very, very, very drug resistant TB. He was hospitalized, and ultimately 2 months after he was first admitted, after he'd been taking all this treatment, the test results came back and he had drug resistant TB. And the doctor said, your treatment begins again today. 2 months wasted. That night he went home and he killed himself. He was 21. There are real costs to diagnostic delay. I think, and this is one of the reasons I'm so interested and passionate about diagnosis, because I think it's an area that we kind of leave to the techie people. That's what happens in the laboratory. But if you think about like what knowing your right diagnosis means in real life, it means knowing what kind of treatment should I expect? How can I plan for the length of hospitalization that I'm going to have? And what I found in Romania was that most people had no idea, because they didn't have the diagnostic information that they had every right to, but it just wasn't possible.
Well, the fact that it's a bacteria, doesn't that kind of indicate that the MMR vaccines might not be able to, it's be a single protein. So you have a more complex code for, the phospholipid membrane and whatnot for the bacteria. That's
what I thought, but that's not what some of the folks from Gates and the other researchers are saying. They think that they can trigger some kind of response using it. And I don't know exactly like what that mechanism of action is, but no, they say that an mRNA vaccine can absolutely be used for
a single protein, because that's all they produce, is a single protein.
Yeah,
In the
yeah,
case of a
they say it
virus,
can.
It's a very specific code protein.
I am cautiously optimistic, but there's a lot of work going into this right now. It's something that basically what happened with COVID was there were already a lot of vaccines in the tuberculosis pipeline, most of which are failing. And immediately they took all of those vaccines that were in the pipeline and said, okay, is this something that we can use on COVID? And and the answer was no. Now we're kind of at the point where, except maybe BCG, the current TB vaccine, which only really protects children from TB meningitis, which is almost always fatal if it's not diagnosed very, very soon. That's why they use that vaccine. That produces some kind of unspecified immune response that now there's some interesting studies looking at, well, could this be helpful for other diseases as well? But now they're kind of back at the point where they're saying, okay, well, we learned a lot from doing this COVID research. Can some of this be applied to TB? Because there's globally, it's well recognized that this disease is, it's killing more people than HIV, far more people than malaria. It's, and we don't have, good solutions for it. So I'm hoping that some of that energy and ultimately funding will go into TB vaccine research. If there was an effective vaccine, that would be game changing. And by effective, I mean 40, 50%. If you think about, I'll use Cape Town as an example. In Cape Town, South Africa, somewhere around 85% of people over the age of 18 have TB infection. It is astounding, the rate of TB infection. So 10% of those people in their lifetimes are going to go on to develop active TB. That's a lot of people. So even, so we set the bar in the TB world for success as being much, much lower. People are saying, well, COVID, the vaccine is only 90% effective. Why isn't it 100% effective? A TB vaccine with 40, 50% efficacy would overnight change the game in places like this where you're so likely to get exposed to TB. It would like overnight, if we could actually get it to everybody who needs it, it would make a huge dent in the disease.
It would have to be administered before the person is actually exposed or acquired the infection.
They're looking at both mechanisms actually, because it is quite common to get re-exposed to it. And I know they've tested some, and there's also some. There's an interesting study that they're also doing in Cape Town with minors where they're looking at, there are some people who just don't get TB infection and we don't know why. If you're working in a South African mine, it is basically a guarantee that you're going to get exposed to TB. The environment is humid because they're misting the mine face to cut down on the silica dust. The rates of TB among miners are absolutely astronomical, but there are some miners who aren't infected. And a few years ago, they started a study to try to figure out why. What is it about the small population? I forget how big the sample size was, but it was quite big. And I think COVID may have slowed down these results, but I think they had finished enrolling the study maybe a couple of years ago. So it'll be interesting to see if anything comes out of that, if they can figure out what the mechanism is that causes some people not to get infected. And if that's the case, then that could be, but that was very new research that, they had just started a few years back. There's a lot of interesting basic science that needs to happen with TB. And I think because the wealthiest countries, particularly the US, had kind of declared TB a finished problem, we left some of that aside, but now some of it is starting to get picked up again. So I'm optimistic for the next decade of research, provided that people really do the funding. Thank you all so much. This was a really interesting discussion.
what in the diagnosis would make somebody feel?
So knowing how they got exposed is a really, is the first thing you want to know. That's why so much of dealing with TB is like basically, what they used to call shoe leather epidemiology. Who's the case and who were they exposed to? And if you know that, then you should be able to treat them based on that knowledge. Like this young man who killed himself should have from the very beginning been treated for drug resistance. His father, his very close household contact had TB. It was obvious where he got it. But as far as other signs, no. Drug-resistant TB looks and behaves just like drug-susceptible TB. There was some mythology. I think it was hopeful mythology back in the early days of drug-resistant TB that some people suggested that drug-resistant strains were less reproduced more slowly, were less, were not as strong as drug-susceptible strains. And there was never really any scientific evidence for that. And ultimately that was proved to be wrong. But that line of thinking is part of what led WHO initially to recommend in the developing world that people with drug-resistant TB not be treated for drug-resistant TB, but rather they be treated for drug-susceptible TB. So that was the recommendation in Russia, and we can thank that those very poor recommendations for a lot of the drug-resistant TB that we have all over Russia and the former Soviet Union, as well as other places in the developing world. It took quite a while for the world to finally recognize that the only way to beat drug-resistant TB is to treat it with drugs that actually work. In hindsight, this seems obvious, but that wasn't the prevailing wisdom back in the early 90s, even late 90s.